On this edition of Independent Sources, Venezuela is burning, the story behind the increasing violence in the South American country.
There's a very serious crime problem in Venezuela, and the students have really been feeling that in their campus.
And East Harlem Stand Up, rebuilding the neighborhood after a massive explosion leaves many dead and others displaced.
The time of turning a blind eye should be over. And this incident is a perfect example of, activism and doing what's right for your neighbor.
Those stories and more coming up on Independent Sources. Welcome to Independent Sources, bringing you news from New York's ethnic and immigrant communities. I'm Sarah Pizon. Venezuela has been in the grip of violent protests since early February. That's when students took to the streets to demand more security after a female student said she was the victim of an attempted rape. Since then, the protests have escalated. Several people have died and hundreds injured in what Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro is calling an attempt by the U.S. to destabilize his government. I sat down with Julie Skursky, a distinguished lecturer at CUNY's Graduate Center and a scholar of Venezuelan politics. We spoke about the origins of the protest and what's being done to address the situation. Thank you for coming, Julie. So a wave of anti-government demonstrations have been happening in Venezuela since early February. What sparked these protests?
You know, they were initially started by some university student groups in a western state of Venezuela. It's on the border with Colombia. And the kind of the immediate reason was the lack of public safety. As you probably know, I know a lot of people know, there's a very serious crime problem in Venezuela, and the students have really been feeling that in their campus. There'd been an attack on a young woman, and so they started a protest demanding greater safety. Now, in actuality, I think one would really have to recognize that there's a whole series of serious problems that have been building up and brewing for quite a while. Besides public safety, poor public services, limitations on civil rights, problems with the health care system. So, and then during the last year, a very high inflation rate. So it's both economic, social, and administrative problems that people are really upset with, kind of across the board.
And so what are they demanding right now?
Well, like you said, it started in early February. They've continued until now. And for one thing, that's really unprecedented in the history of Venezuela. There have been lots of demonstrations. It's a history of demonstrations. But these have been more sustained and more widespread geographically. They began pretty immediately to spread from the west of the country to the capital and several other cities. So as that happened, they also changed what they're about. I can't say that the demands are clear because they aren't. But to even talk about this, I have to say a little bit about this coalition opposition force. There isn't a single opposition party. There's a coalition that groups a whole number of parties and organizations. And so certain of the leaders of that coalition, once the student demonstrations had started in the West, they then called their followers out to the street and decided to make this a more full, critique of the government, let's say. Okay. And so that's sort of what's happened. It's become students and masses of other kinds of people, largely middle class and upper class, but all kinds of working people too. And the demands of the leader, not the student leaders, the political leaders then became something quite different. And they started demanding that the president leave office.
And so how has the government reacted to this?
I think this whole process is characterized by a great deal of, it's kind of decentered, it's not centrally controlled. And also, it's a government that in many ways, it's had problems of administration, of control, and it's reflected in how its police and military and intelligence forces react. So there was initially kind of violent repression of the student demonstrations in February, and I think 2 people were killed initially. And this started in itself then kind of a dynamic that added to the reasons for the protest. Because once people were killed, some were injured, many were injured, and some were arrested, then that became part of the point, you know, what people were demanding. But the government, I mean, to characterize how they reacted, they've certainly used lots of tear gas, in some cases pellets, water guns, as this has gotten bigger. But as far as I can tell, it's hard to tell, and I talk to lots of people, but it's very hard to tell. For the most part, they haven't used those kinds of instruments until demonstrations have gotten right up close to certain government installations and attacks on those buildings have occurred. And there has been significant property destruction. So it's become kind of a dynamic.
President Maduro has accused the U.S. of using these protests to destabilize his country.
Right.
What do
government,
you, his
yeah.
government.
Right.
What do you have to say about that? Do you think that's?
There's a very long history of the United States government really trying to influence, or in the past, you know, actually overturn governments throughout the Caribbean and Latin America. There's also a very long history of CIA and other kinds of organizations trying to influence outcomes. There's a WikiLeaks that released documents in 2006 about U.S. government financing for various opposition organizations. So I think it's not the case that the U.S. government is trying to overthrow the Venezuelan government, and I think that's, on the part of Maduro, an extreme simplification that gets the government off the hook. On the other hand, I think it's plausible that there's certain kinds of U.S. funds helping support some of the opposition groups. But that doesn't, you know, explain what's happening, in my view.
Do you think this will hurt future relations between Venezuela and the U.S.?
Well, they aren't good right now, but you know, some of the leaders of the Venezuelan opposition have called for the U.S. to intervene, saying that there's such chaos and disorder that we need outside establishment of order. If any kind of call like that is listened to, then there'll be terrible relations. And so hopefully I mean, my hope would be that there would be some kind of way that these different opposition groups and the government can actually sit down and talk and deal with things within the country.
Right. Well, have the protests so far incited any change, and do you think, if not, will it?
I don't. Nothing positive has come out of it. Certainly, it's called attention to you know, long-standing problems in the country and how it's being run. But one of the things that's been really missed or underreported is the fact that nobody can tell exactly how many they are and who they are. But certain sectors that identify with the opposition have carried out some very violent acts. And so the deaths that have come about, and I just received a new human rights report, that now are counted as about 33. At least 17 of them have been of government supporters, and at least 3 of them have been of police forces. There are masked people who shoot from motorcycles. There are snipers. And nobody can really tell who they are. So it's one of the, and of course, the protesters call for peaceful protests. For the most part, they have been peaceful protests. But this is an element that is very destabilizing, creates a lot of fear. And one other thing that certain groups, and it's probably just very small sectors of them within the opposition have done, is create these improvised barricades within neighborhoods. And they don't let people pass. And some of them have set them up in a way that they're really death traps for people on motorcycles. And so there are people who have been killed. And people on motorcycles are identified publicly with support for the government. So there are various tactics like that have caused a great deal of horror and really have not been reported internationally.
Besides the sanctions that have already been put on Venezuela by the U.S., do you think that the U.S. will be further involved? in trying to do something about it?
It's hard for me to imagine that it would try to get directly involved in any way. There are various Congress people who are calling, from Florida, calling for measures. It's hard for me to picture. For one thing, Venezuela continues to be a really important oil supplier for the U.S., and no matter what the political shifts, that's never come under question. And also, Venezuela, through this international organization, which is one of several that were organized under Chavez, called Petrocaribe, sells subsidized oil to 14 different Caribbean nations, many of which are very poor, and most of which do not agree with Venezuela's politics. And the U.S. recognizes that if the opposition were to take power and end that subsidized oil program, it might cause serious unrest in a number of Caribbean countries, and I'm not talking about Cuba. So there are things on both sides that they don't all line up, as to what makes sense for either country.
Well, thank you so much, Julie.
Thank you.
Still to come on the show, the problem of false reports of child abuse. Before that, Abby Ishola has some other news.
Thanks, Sarah. Here's a look at some headlines from the ethnic and community media. From Color Lines, women of color with criminal records are facing challenges finding work, and the issue is being overlooked. A new study by the Community Legal Services of Philadelphia finds that much of the research, programming, and policies that benefit those with criminal records focus more on men. The study finds that women face more challenges when looking for employment than men. This due to society's view of women being less prone to criminal activity. LGBT Native Americans have mixed feelings about Facebook's new gender-identifying term. In the past, Facebook users were only given the option to choose between male and female when identifying their sex. Now the social media website allows users to choose the term Two-Spirit. Indian Country Today spoke to many indigenous people who identify as Two-Spirit who are happy with the change. Two-spirited, like queer, is a term to describe Aboriginal people who don't fit into society's mold regarding sexuality and gender. On the other hand, some in the indigenous community say it's misguided for the term to be used by non-Native Americans, as some will misappropriate another group's cultural identity. The Chinese community is feeling the pinch from the spike in pork prices. Tsingtao Daily reports that after the recent outbreak of the porcine epidemic diarrhea virus, or PED, the nation's pork supply has decreased significantly, causing prices to increase. Right now in Chinatown, barbecue pork has gone from $2.49 per pound to almost double that price. Grocers in Chinatown say the price increase hasn't affected their customer flow, but people are buying less pork. Restaurant owners complain that their profits have gone down since pork dishes on their menu remain at a fixed price. From El Diario La Prensa, one man is using radio to connect Guatemalans in New York to their people back home. Leonardo Ambrosio, a Guatemalan human rights activist, is preparing to launch Voices Without Borders, a new radio show that will cover human rights topics out of Guatemala. The show will transmit from St. Peter's Church on Lexington Avenue in Manhattan and broadcast on 97.1 FM every Thursday from 8 to 10 p.m. Voices Without Borders is sponsored by the Guatemala Human Rights Commission. And finally, from the Norwood News, can the performing arts change people's perception of the Bronx? Eva Bornstein, executive director for Lehman Center for the Performing Arts, thinks so. Within the past couple of years, the Poland native has brought in music and performing heavyweights such as Patti LaBelle, the New York Philharmonic, and Jerry Seinfeld. This year, jazz musician Michael Bolton will be added to the list. Bornstein is hoping to attract people from out of town who may have stereotypical views on what the Bronx is like. Those were just a few headlines from the ethnic and community media. Independent sources will be back right after this.
Thanks for staying tuned. A study from the National Coalition for Child Protection Reform found that approximately 4 out of 5 cases of alleged abuse of children in the U.S. turned out to be false. Sometimes children themselves make these reports, or someone with a grudge who might want to hurt a foster parent. Whatever the case, advocates say it's a real problem that they're still trying to solve. I spoke to Pat O'Brien, president of the NYS Citizens Coalition for Children, about the issue and what is being done to address it. So how rampant is this problem of false abuse reports?
Well, it happens a lot. When I used to do surveys of people, when I train them, we bring in seasoned parents, and I always do a survey. How many of you have had an experience of at least one false report? And it was a group of a lot of foster parents, and generally half the people in the room raised their hand. So it's almost part of the job of being a foster parent is to know that people sometimes make false reports, and how to handle it is really the key to retention. How the agency handles it, and how the foster parents handle it when it's done. And the important thing is to prepare people for it so it's not unexpected when it happens.
But why do people make these false reports?
Well, a lot of the children who are placed in the system are placed due to drug-related neglect. They don't know they're being abused, but they are absolutely being neglected, and sometimes they're separated from their families. So I think on part there's a fantasy that they'll go home sooner if they say the person that they placed them with is a bad person. So sometimes there's false allegations from there. Certainly when your parent is in denial over things like drugs, you're going to displace your anger onto the system, and the most identifiable entity in the system is the foster parent. So sometimes false allegations come from there. Other times, if you got any issue at all with your neighbors, you're a target in the community because you have kids. So somebody could just say, well, I'll call them in for abuse, and they know they'll terribly disrupt their life. You know, and on a rare occasion, professionals who don't need to call the child abuse hotline because maybe a child had reported they were slapped or smacked, and something you never report a birth parent for doing, but they feel like there's a higher standard for foster parents, and indeed there is. You should call the foster parents agency and make sure that they get some retraining, because what's not illegal or not even child abuse is against the regulations if you basically raise a child the way your parent raised you. So there's a variety of reasons why false allegations or allegations that do not come to the level of real child abuse get called in.
You mentioned that it's all about knowing how to handle these types of situations. So how do people handle this?
Well, I mean, the real important thing is when we're preparing foster parents to become foster parents, even before they become foster parents, they should hear from our seasoned foster parents to know that, you know, it's going to happen at some point. It's not if it happens, it's when it's happening, and how you handle it is real important to hear the senior people tell you. You know, you got to be cooperative. You got to know if you didn't do anything wrong, to sit down and hear what they're saying and try to offer an explanation. And indeed, if you did something you weren't supposed to do, but it doesn't raise to the level of child abuse, but it is against the regs, really apologize for it, willingly accept new training on it, because it's tough to raise kids who've been traumatized. They have behaviors that are very stress-provoking, and the grown-ups really need sometimes a little extra training or a little extra intervention, or really extra support to get through the hard times.
Can you give us an example of how one of these cases was handled?
All right. Well, if you call in the hotline, they will initiate what you call child protection investigation, as if the person committed some sort of child abuse. So they come to your door unannounced, and then they talk to you about the allegations. 90% of them, it's dropped. It's unsubstantiated. So it's real important when we're preparing foster parents to understand that people make false allegations, but the system really does investigate to the point where 90% of the time they're not finding anything indicated. And even the 10% of the time that they do, it's really for a regulation violation rather than any sort of real abuse. And of course, if there's real abuse going on, you're going to want to deal with that, and you want to close the home, and you want to protect the child. But I'm talking about the particular cases where it's not real abuse. It's somebody who's just choosing to give this person a hard time for a lot of logical reasons, even if they aren't good reasons.
How is this? Is this crisis turning certain parents off from wanting to foster children?
That's the big fear, is that if we don't handle it properly, particularly the unsubstantiated ones, well, we could lose foster parents even if it's unsubstantiated. So the key there, one, is to help them understand right from the start that this will happen. It's sort of part of the job, and when it does, we should support you through this. And then help them understand it's really something that you have to be a parent that understands that when you're committed to your children who come to you, there's going to be all sorts of issues. This is just one of many, but it's traumatic, particularly for the foster parents. Traumatic, particularly if they weren't prepared for it.
So how do you investigate those claims?
We're a parent advocacy group, so we don't do investigations at all. We basically handle the foster parents who call us and they say, you know, I got falsely accused of abuse. What do I do? So we do a lot of hand-holding during the process. We might do a lot of advising during the process, but we don't have any role in the investigation whatsoever.
Who then investigates those?
Oh, the state of New York, Child Protection Services. It's usually somebody from the county or from the city that comes in after the state sends them the report.
How difficult is it for them to really investigate those claims and really distinguish whether or not there was
difficult for who?
for the state?
Well, they have a whole process for that. They anything that they believe rises to a level of abuse, there's somebody at the house within 24 hours of the call in. So the state is on top of that part. There's alternative investigations, by the way. There's a system, or they call family assessment, where you don't have to raise it to a level of a full child protection. And the state has gotten a little bit more involved in that as well. There's not a high risk of abuse, but families need some help. And we'd like for our foster families to be in that same categories. Obviously, there are times they can use extra intervention. They can use extra help, even when they have in no way, shape, or form are abusing their children. The traumatized children experience a lot of behaviors that are triggered in new foster homes, and families need additional support. And we prefer that mode rather than a full-blown child protection, hearing and investigation.
Are there other organizations like yours that help help the families dealing with the situations?
I think we're the main statewide one. There are lots of counties have local support groups that help out the families as well, and we're a statewide organization in New York State, and we get our families together on a yearly basis. We do training on this subject and other subjects, and we help keep parents informed, and we're a sounding board for some people who might not have local people to call, so they call us.
How far are you kind of preaching this campaign for foster families?
Well, I didn't even know there was a campaign, but the thing is, our single greatest call, in addition to things about taxes or whatever, can I declare a tax, is this problem. So it's a matter of just trying to make the public aware and the investigative bodies aware and the professionals aware that if it doesn't rise to a level of real abuse, report it in a different way. Call the agency, call the social worker. But some other professionals, like teachers, are taught in class. Everything gets reported to the state hotline, and let the state hotline figure it out. And then once it gets to that level, the state hotline usually initiates a child protection proceeding, but they don't have to. Even the state has a choice to do more of an assessment and support the family, or a full-blown investigation. And we certainly advocate family assessment in those 10 situations where a foster parent might need additional support.
Great. Thank you, Pat.
All right. Thank you.
When we come back, rebuilding in East Harlem after a devastating disaster. Finally from us, 2 East Harlem residents came together in response to the massive explosion that left 8 dead, 54 injured, and many more people displaced. Rafael Benavides and Clark Peña talk about recovering and rebuilding through an initiative Peña started called East Harlem We Stand.
This all began a couple days after the incident. Everybody didn't know what was going on. But once that subsided, people started wondering how to help those people who were in need. Some of our members called us and said, let's get together and let's do something about it.
So we reached out to New Beginning Ministries, and Reverend Dominique Regis, his pastor. And I wasn't even into the second sentence before he says, absolutely. Let's open the church. This is the community's house. So what they did was they moved from the parish, one floor up to where we are now, and have been folding clothes, setting up shoes for when folks come in need. They're being given to them directly.
The response from New Yorkers has been tremendous. At certain points, we have been forced to stop the collecting of the donations because we have been overwhelmed.
We already have 2 locations that are full to capacity, with coats, jackets, toiletries, canned goods, and the calls keep coming in.
We had more items that we can actually store. Now we're reaching the point again where we're running out of space. So either we're going to have to make sure that all the families are taken care of, making sure that they don't need anything else, or we're going to need to find more space. So because that's what New Yorkers do. You know, we take care of each other.
The time of turning a blind eye should be over, and this incident is a perfect example of activism and doing what's right for your neighbor.
What has been a learning experience for us is the way that this whole situation came to be, how the community came together to become the first responders, because you never know exactly how these tragedies played out until you actually live in it. Our idea was that we were going to be able to collect as many donations and be able to give it to a bigger entity like the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, or anything like that, for them to be able to work with the families. Accidents do happen, tragedies do happen. Now the question is, as a community, how do we come together as a society? How do we come together and help each other out?
That's our show this week. Thanks for staying tuned. Till next time, be independent-minded.